If
Okay, so what I'm going to do is just a few minutes before we welcome our first guest speaker, is I just want to do something in the way of reorientation. So I'm just going to try a bit of a screen share here, and let's see if somebody can give me a thumbs up. Is that working for everybody? Great, look at that. Many thumbs all at once. Fantastic. Okay, so if I just make that into a slideshow, it'll probably be a little bit better. So, in this series of tutorials, which have been, as Angeline said, overall convened by the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership, what we can think of our journey so far is really looking at various aspects of research paradigms. And we have gone in this series each side of Christmas, so this is why it might be helpful just to do a little bit of reorientation. So before Christmas, we looked at decolonisation and how this applies to two aspects of the emergent research paradigm, ontology and epistemology across the social sciences. What we're going to do in today's tutorial and in the next one in the series is to look at the other two key aspects of the research paradigm. Today we look at decolonisation in methodology, and next time it will be axiology or ethics. And I think it's worthwhile recognizing, remembering, recalling, or thinking about how these various aspects do interconnect and are mutually influential. A good demonstration of this, and this is something I share in my own research methods teaching to our doctorate in clinical psychology trainees. So a good model comes from a gentleman by the name of Sean Wilson. Now, Sean is, I've known him for about 4 or 5 years or so, and Kerry, one of our guest speakers, and Nancy, another of our guest speakers, they know him as well through slightly different worlds. But for the rest of you who might not know him or might not know of him more accurately, let's actually see if we can meet him. So here's a picture of Sean. Sean is Obasquire Cree. Originally grew up in what's referred to as northern Manitoba. These days you'll see him living in Australia, where he works for Southern Cross University. Got a couple of his books as well, just on that slide there. And the material I'm going to present is really drawn from the one on the bottom right, Research is Ceremony. Research is Ceremony is an enormously influential work for, shall we say, the newer generation of people who are interested in Indigenous inquiries. It's been a truly inspirational work for many young Indigenous researchers. So if it's not a book you've read already, it's certainly one I would commend to you. What Sean does is he looks at these four entities of the research paradigm and he puts them in something which looks more or less like a medicine wheel. Now, for those of you who are, I guess, familiar with, native ways of knowing and being in, what's now North America, medicine wheels might be something you've come across before. The thing is with a medicine wheel, it's always there to demonstrate how four constituent parts of really anything here, it's research methods. Many things can be illustrated in this way, particularly value systems. So 4 constituent parts together are mutually influential, and what emerges, as Sean says here, is the whole paradigm is greater than the sum of its parts. So in this series of tutorials, we've gone sort of sequentially from epistemology to ontology to methodology to axiology. But what you can obviously understand, and I'll show you Sean's wording in a little while, is the fact that these are not necessarily sequential, but, you know, pre-existing and multiply interlinked. So these are Sean's descriptions, and he uses, is a great aspect of Sean's writing. It's simultaneously precise and yet highly engaging. It's a rare skill for people who write about research methods, I must say. What he reminds us of, and I think this is absolutely critical, is that, you know, whether a researcher is conscious or not of their paradigm, they still operate under a certain research paradigm. This is something which I see very often in my own discipline of psychology, where many of my experimental colleagues, they're not aware that the way they inquire around questions is actually deeply reflective of very Western, very Eurocentric value systems. They simply believe that theirs is the scientific method and therefore the right way, and therefore other ways are somehow subjective and to be dismissed. Right from the outset, of course, Sean's telling us here that there are many, many, many different ways in which we can know the world. So he takes us through an ontology you can read for yourself. He says it's that simple question of asking, what is real? Epistemology, he describes, how do I know what is real? And he goes to, as you can see from what's written here, to show the links, the essential links which exist between sort of epistemology and ontology. What you believe is real is how you're going to affect how you think about that reality. Methodology is where we find ourselves today. How do I find out more about this reality? And in axiology is that system of ethics, morals, values, where we ask ourselves, what is it legitimate for me to do to gain this knowledge? And more importantly, you know, what will this knowledge be used for? So that's something of a brief orientation into where we are in the process. Those references I'd commend both to you, particularly the first of the 2, Researchers Ceremony. And what I'm going to do now is stop the share. So I just want to check briefly with Adriana. If I'm correct, I think Alejandra was the first of our guest speakers, yeah? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to become quiet and I'm going to let you introduce Alejandra. Thank you very much, Adriana.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. We have Alejandra today joining us from Chile. Alejandra studied biology, and then she specialized in the cognitive body integration method, a biological model that integrates the body as a fundamental dimension of human behavior and experience. Her interest in research focuses on emotional states and body movement, and in movement-based embodied contemplative practices. So today we'll hear what Alejandra has to tell us and share with us on how this method relates to the aims of this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana.
Alejandra, would you like me to share your slides?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this seminar. In this presentation, I would like to share with you my experience in researching the area of cognitive science and the need for a paradigm shift that changed the way I see things and understand the world I inhabit. This experience relates to the objective of this seminar, which aims at presenting methodologies that can be used to decolonize research and how we come to know as well as decolonize ourselves. To make a change of paradigm is not easy, since it implies that we need to observe ourselves moment by moment and how we are positioned in the world we inhabit within this new paradigm for observation and reflection. These new forms are different from the paradigm we learn as children, which tell us there is a world outside us, with its physical, chemicals, and biological laws, the so-called objective world. Therefore, to say, we need to make a change in the way we see and understand the world is to say we need to make a change in ourselves. That implies a behavioral change in which, in order to sustain over the time, requires a change in our biological structure. The next slide, please. This paradigm change I'm talking about originates in our understanding of what life is. Yes, is a problem with the slide? Yeah.
Ahí sí se va a enterar, Ale.
Yes. What is a living system? Maturana and Varela in 1984, two Chilean biologists proposed that living organisms, like the unicellular organisms, are dynamic systems that produce themselves moment by moment and that respond to the dynamic organization of molecular relations that constitute them. This is what they conceptualize as autopoietic systems. This means living beings have an internal operation of a circular and recursive character. That this implies that everything that happens to the individual is referred to the changes of the organism's internal states, and not to the changes of external environment within which it is observed. In other words, the theory of autopoiesis was groundbreaking, as it says that if a living system suffers a perturbation from the environment, the effect of this interaction depends on the living system structure on that moment and not on the external stimulus. This means there is no internal or external agent that controls the system operation, but that the system is determined by the physiological operation of the organism, which in turn modulate the global state of the organism. Therefore, the world that this organism know is determined by the structure of its physiological operation. Next slide, please. In Homo sapiens, language emerged in the way of life of a social systems. Language is understood as an action, as a praxis of living. And the praxis of living creates a way of life, which is according to the reality that language generates. Therefore, language is in relation to the paradigms of that culture. According to the autopoiesis paradigm, we can take two paths in the way we relate to each other within our culture, two explanatory paths of reality. The first is the objectivity without parentheses, and the second is the objectivity between parentheses. In the words of Maturana, in the explanatory path of the objectivity without parentheses, the observer implicitly or explicitly assumes that the existence takes place regardless of what he or she does, that things exist regardless of whether he or she knows them, and whether or not he or she can know about them. In this explanatory path, the observer is not a participant in what he or she accepts as explanation. This translates into a single domain of reality, a single universe, a transcendental reference. On the other hand, on the second path, the path of the objectivity between parentheses, the observer explicitly accepts that he or she is a human being, a living system, that he or she cognitive abilities as an observer are biological phenomena, and that if he or she wants to explain his or her cognitive abilities as an observer, he or she must do so by showing how they arise as biological phenomena in their realization as a living system. Therefore, the observer is a participant in what he or she accepts as an explanation, which translates into the following. The explanations are not reductionist and non-transcendental, because in them there is no search for a single ultimate explanation for everything. The observer realizes that he lives in a multiverse, in many different, equally legitimate explanatory realities, and that in this, an explanatory disagreement is an invitation for a responsible reflection in coexistence. If we take the path of objectivity between parentheses, that is the second path, we understand that the knowledge of a living being is a biological phenomenon, which is constituted moment by moment in the physiological operation of the living organism in its interaction with the environment in which it lives. Therefore, there are as many realities as there are living organisms. Next slide, please. From this paradigm, different methodologies arise to understand and study human behavior. The Inactive Approach, proposed by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roach, understand that cognition consists of the enactment of a world. From this perspective, the world is not a given, but rather the world that we as individual inhabit is constituted moment by moment in the individual structural coupling as a result of his ontogeny. The ontogeny refers to the history of structural coupling of the organism with the environment during their daily life. Therefore, this history of structural coupling modifies the organic structure of the individual and the way of interpreting the world he inhabits. This is how the imperative to incorporate the study of experience to understand human behavior arises, in order to understand how the individual interprets the world he inhabits. Thus, in 1996, Francisco Varela proposed neurophenomenology as a methodological tool to understand the complexity of consciousness. They call it hard problem of consciousness. That is to understand why we have the experience of feeling in a certain way, what is called the qualia, or in other terms, the subjective experience. In his research program, Varela proposes to integrate into the traditional neurobiological approach methodologies for the exploration of experience, like phenomenology, and thus to establish correlation between these two dynamic structures, the physiological structure and the experiential one, and redefine their process by reciprocal determination. By situating research practice within the Inactive Approach and the neurophenomenological program, it becomes evident that the paradigm of objectivity ignores the body. However, the phenomenology of the body is central to understand how a person perceives the world he or she inhabits. For example, human beings with their capacity for reflection can recognize an emotional state in themselves through the proprioceptive perception of the sensation movement of the body. That is to say, attending to their bodily sensations, postures, and movement of the body. Next slide, please. Another methodology that enriches the process of decolonization is the method of cognitive body integration. The cognitive body integration method was created by Chilean biologist Carmen Cordero and is based in the study of the emotional phenomena from the perspective of the biology of knowledge proposed by Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. This is known as MIC for his Spanish acronym, and consists of a systemic model that proposes that the behavior of a living organism is constituted by three behavioral domains, which operate in a disjoint way: the body, the relation, and the language. This disjoint operation refers to the fact that each domain has its own entities and operations. That is, the domains are modulated among them, but without mixing the ways in which they operate. The relationship of these three domains is particular to each individual, which determines a biotypology, which manifests itself in certain modes of doing, thinking, and relating to others. This typology is always dynamic, since we are constantly learning in the relationship of reciprocal and permanent adaptation that we have with our environment. This biotypology is constituted by genetic, biographical, and cultural components. From this perspective, both psychological health and well-being of the body are related to the degree of coherence between the state of these three behavioral domains. Therefore, the objective of the MIC is to reach well-being through the restitution of autonomy and emotional and reflexive plasticity that generate coherence between an individual's way of doing, relating, and thinking. The challenge of decolonization implies a change in lifestyle, a behavioral change, and a change in how we relate to other humans and non-human beings. The MIC provides bodily practice that allows people to generate a change in coherence from the resources available in our own biological structures as individuals. From this perspective, learning new behaviors require a change in the structure of our body so that this change is sustained over time. As each individual is unique, the design of practices offered by this method are customized to the structure and purpose of the individual. Specifically, these practices consist of exercises in which the individual synchronizes in a present the intention of the attention towards the body during the execution of a specific sequence of movements, with reflection of what happens to the person in that moment. In this way, individuals learn to modulate their cognitive states by themselves, placing themselves in the space where they are, within the environment in which they exist. This grants the person an emotional autonomy that modulates the physiological state consistent with the present contingencies, maintaining well-being as a coherence with existence, instead of a well-being understood as a joy or enjoyment. To conclude, both the inactive approach with the neurophenomenological proposal and the cognitive body integration methods are methods that invite us to observe ourselves in an introspective way, that invite us to think about our way of life, the way we relate to each other, and what we reflect upon. Observing our own experience and situating ourselves from the sensation of our body in the here and now is an invitation to make a change in our way of life and begin to decolonize ourselves and our community. For example, we can move from a personal experience to the sharing of those individual bodily experiences with others, and thus create a consciousness of living in coherence with our body and not only from reasoning. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. That was really insightful, and yeah, thanks for explaining that in a very eloquent manner. Steve, would you like to introduce our next guest?
Well, yeah, sort of good question. I wouldn't presume to speak for our next guest. I think she'll be able to introduce herself far better than I could. But I do really want to welcome her. What we're going to do now, and this is one of the intriguing possibilities of Zoom, is we're going to cross the Pacific digitally, or if we also think about it another way, project ourselves forward in time, because we have Kerry Cleaver, who is joining us from the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, at some god-awful time in the morning. We're very fortunate to have Kerry with us. Kerry and also Nancy, who will be speaking later, and we know each other through being members of Indigenous Inquiry Circle at the International Congress on Qualitative Inquiry, which is usually held at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Kerry done some fantastic work, and one piece of work published late last year really caught my attention, and I thought, wow, we have to have some input from this very capable woman. So you're very welcome, Kerry. So I'll be glad to pass to you now.
Kia ora, thanks, Stephen. Will you manage the presentation, or am I sharing?
You can share if you choose, Kerry. It's up to you.
But have you got it up there? Could you do it for me?
I could, yeah. If you just give me a moment, I'll be glad to do that, Kerry.
I do have it. Yeah, that would be easier. Thank you.
Okay, there's no problem there.
Sorry, we did not quite manage that. So I'll just start, and as Stephen's doing that, he can move on to the second slide. Ngā mihi kia koutou, ko waio, ko auraki te mauka, ko aparima te awa, ko takitimu te waka, he wahine kai tahu ahau, ko Kerry Cleaver toku ikua. So that is my very short version of my pepeha, which introduces who I am in relation to the Indigenous peoples that I come from, who are kaitahu, the waka, the vehicle by which we arrived in Aotearoa centuries ago, and the river that feeds my people. I just wanted to start with my pepeha because that's how we do that as Māori or as kaitahu in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that in itself is part of a decolonizing process where we claim who we are and introduce and center and make connections and relationships based on our traditional ways of meeting and greeting. So for me, utilizing Indigenous knowledges is about connecting to our genealogies, and those genealogies are also connected to places and resources that we have walked for centuries. Aoraki, our mountain, which you see in that picture there, is also our tupuna, our ancestor, and part of our creation stories. The importance of self in research is an act of decolonization. Resisting ideas of neutrality, it reframes research about relationships. PPH is part of this and how we make connections. Could you move to the next slide, please? So just to start off, no better way to introduce decolonizing methodologies than through the seminal work of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith. And the starting point of my own journey in decolonizing methodologies was not kaupapa Māori, although as you see from the picture, the book is pretty worn. I've read it from front to back many times, but I went round in circles quite a lot in formulating how I would go about doing research in my community. Linda provided a template based on the knowledge and experiences of our peoples, and provided a template for all peoples across the planet about how we might approach research in a manner that upheld who people were, where they came from, and the purposeful direction that research was being produced for. Decolonizing methodologies centers a serious amount of thinking about purpose. Research traditionally is about self, academic production, status, legitimacy, and about meeting goals within hallowed halls of academia. My research asked, how will this support my participants as co-researchers, as creators, as storytellers? I just want to reference here the work of Free Air around how we work in spaces of oppression, and in order to emancipate those that face oppression, they must be at the table, they must be part of the process rather than having research done on them. So this is pretty much a rundown in her book of some of the ways in which we can respond in a decolonized fashion. For most of us doing research, we utilize many of those ideas, claiming space, utilizing storytelling, celebrating our survival, for instance, networking as part of that process. And it's just a really good reminder that there's no one way to do research, that if we're to truly decolonize our methodologies, we really need to resist the way in which research has been framed in a set of ways that is done. And for instance, for me, one of the challenges was the idea within my institution that in order to do research in the social services and the humanities, there was a template that you needed to utilize, that you go out and you meet with 25 participants and what that would answer your question, and then you data analysis that, and then draw up some thematics from that as a general rule. So some thinking about how we might do that in a way that isn't just utilizing what is a white supremacist template of research, and start thinking about how we center our traditional knowledges, other worldviews, into how we go about that. Next slide, please. So in thinking about that, I went back to our pūrākau, our stories that hold us to who we are on the land that we live. And I want to tell you one of those stories now. So Kaiamior, this range here that you see is a range of hills within the lower centre of our South Island, which we call Te Waipounamu, the water of greenstone, but is more well known as the South Island of New Zealand. That's the land that my people have walked for many years. This little bit of area is part of our traditional hunter and gathering area, where traditionally our people moved from the coast, all around the coast of the bottom part of the South Island, and went into this area to hunt and gather for fish, for birds. In that process, we also collected their told stories, met, shared, and then the process of then returning home to our main bases, we stopped off and we shared food that we'd collected on the way. So the story about Kaiamior, who was a wonderful ancestral woman figure within our culture, is that she took a hunting party through to Central Otago, and like many parties before, they were captured by a giant called Kopuwai. Kopuwai killed all of her hunting party, but held her tied to a flax bush. She was very clever and astute, and so she'd managed to trick Kopuwai the giant and fled down what is our most significant river in the South Island, Mata'o, the Clutha River. He woke, realised that she had gone, and swallowed the river up. We believe that there was an event at that time that meant that something happened to that waterway. So that's part of our history and stories of the land that we live on. She managed to escape. She went back to the coast. She had some tricks up her sleeve, took another hunting party back up and overcame him in order so that our hunting parties could collect and keep collecting kai. So the reason why I'm telling you that story is because for us, many of our stories have been retold in a Western way over time, and the place of woman has been usurped in that process. Reclaiming our stories and utilizing them in our research means that we have another opportunity for future generations to center who we were as people, who we are as people, and bring to life those stories in the here and now. Just a moment. So the act of finding them in research that creating those other narratives, pre-colonial and post-colonial, provide opportunities of being kaitahu woman. The centre of my research, where we tell our own stories, our future stories, and our past stories, is part of that process. Next slide, please. This is part of a wider international Indigenous movement of how we remember or do the process of remembering. And one of the seminal parts, influences for me, was Leanne Simpson and her Dancing on Our Turtles' Back. And she has this beautiful quote, which I think's so relevant to doing research in the now, but connected back through time. So part of being Indigenous in the 21st century is that regardless of where or how we have grown up, we've been bathed in a vat of cognitive imperialism, perpetuating the idea that Indigenous peoples were not and are not thinking peoples, an insidious mechanism to promote neo-assimilation and obfuscate, I never say that word, the historic atrocities of colonialism. I think that what she's really saying there, and what I took out of that, is that it's impossible to 100% decolonize your research, but we can resist while acknowledging the complexities. Here and now, colonization has impacted on our identities. It's created concepts of authenticity, encompassment, where we are impacted in multiple ways, and in order to be Indigenous or take that space, we must meet criteria assessed by others. Indigenous peoples require the space to process our own decolonial processes in our own times. It's individual and collective the ways we have been subjugated. For me, decolonial methods meant allowing for participant differences. So it really saying that there's no one way to come and participate in decolonized research, because we come with a whole history of what led to where we are now. We've been bathed in that vat of white supremacy or settler normativity. Next slide, please. So this is a visual representation of the research that I have been doing for my PhD. And it's really about the principle. There's a set of principles within that that are on the outside and the inside of this visual representation. But really the heart of the research was about what my responsibilities were to my community. So in order to research in a way that is Ngāi Tahu, from my people's perspective, I had some obligations to my community in order to research in a way that maintained and respected who they were. So the relational aspect of it is at the center of that. The research was created in order to set up the principle that I could go about the research in the way that I wanted to. And I drew on those traditional hunter and gathering trails, or mahikakai trails, and created a building that then held within it the principles in the way that I could safely care for my participants. So the model is, there's a circle. That circle is actually a building structure of my people. For anyone that's been to Aotearoa New Zealand or seen anything about Māori, you're probably used to seeing carved houses. Well, that's not the reality of the history of my people. At the bottom of the South Island, we lived in round houses that were temporary shelters called whare. So that doubles as the space by which you can safely do your research, but also the space by which you are traveling the research journey with the people that you have sharing their experiences and knowledges. So there are a few po tohu, or signposts, along the way. That was how we navigated and knew that we were on the right trail. And I found those ones that were relevant to the research that we were doing. Inside that whare is a set of principles. Those principles are about how we respect and provide safety and self-determination for participants that were in the research. So they are Māori words. I'm just going to translate them. Self-determination, relationships, care and support, caretakers of the story, doing the right thing, and accepting participants as experts. So they're key concepts or principles within Māori worldview that led the way in which the research was done. I just want to quickly talk, like I created this space. There's a whole lot of other work that's going on within our country and internationally about how we decolonize spaces of research, and not just the theoretical spaces, but the actual spaces where research occurs, because for most of us, we enter institutions and we're presented with what is a Western way of living and doing. So there's some resistance there about how we might create safe spaces and what frames our research and what's important to that in order to make sure that our identities and our cultures and our ways of doing are at the center of that. Next slide, please. So we don't need to give up everything that is 21st century in order to do research that's centered in who we are culturally and who our people are intergenerationally and traditionally. The use of 21st century tools is a part of that process of representation and claiming. And for my research, I wove in the use of photography, my participants, and really challenged the idea of some of those methodologies that are participatory action principles like photo voice, and moved that to a next level that I was comfortable with as far as moving from a kaupapa Māori or kaupapa kaitahu way, in which we could claim back the lens while understanding the history of photography for our people. So for us in the South Island, when the colonists came over and settled on our land, they used our women as postcards for enticing other European people over. Our Ngaitahu women were quite fair-skinned and could pass as white, but yet tanned, so we were put on postcards and sent around the world. We were also represented as like the maternal element, that was the only role that we had was to bear children, which is not unusual to the rest of the world. So the claiming of the lens, and for women to be able to tell their own stories and interpret that, including really, in essence, just taking a light idea and then going out and determining what part of the stories they were telling, was really important, and an example of utilizing tools, but also utilizing them in a claiming and reframing part of being mana wahine Māori women's rights perspectives. I also just want to reference that for us, our artists have told many stories over time. Perhaps they are the most clearest way in which we've been able to find our history that has been erased. There's those photographs that have been given in which the white man was behind the lens and deciding what was taken, but there's also other traditional ways in which we utilized art. So we're merging together the past with the present and identifying who we are and where we've come from that perspective. Cool, next one. I'm almost finished. I'm guessing I'm about up with time. So I just wanted, as an example, to share with you the work of Ngahuia Murphy as part of the woven collection of women that are working in the space of decolonizing research in regards to the place of the Indigenous woman. So this work has been pretty important for me in my journey of research. And also, I'm not going to talk lots about this, but other than there's lots of different ways that we can use ceremony, spirituality, but also the way that we are in order to tell our stories and reframe the position of who we are now and in the past, and they're connected for us in our experiences in the now. So the purpose of that is to create a huge network where our research is just a small part of a big weaving of collective voice. It's not more or less important than those other parts, and those parts collectively create unity in how we frame who we are. And the next picture, next slide, sorry. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is from 1906, and these women, we were told that our ancestors, our Ngāi Tahu women, really didn't do much, that they weren't the leaders. And these are early dress reformers, Māori women, that were really challenging the status quo at the time, but also leading out some of our land rights. And I'm just going to finish with a quote from Ngahuia Te Awa Kotuku. The power and rightness and sheer joy of being a Māori woman, of knowing that stretching out on either side of you like a vast glittering fan of light, a woman of courage, initiative, healing, imagination, terror, and deep, deep knowledge, whose adventures crossed mountain ranges and spanned the huge ocean, whose visions knew no bounds, whose researching and inventiveness discovered new fibers, new foods, new richness in a strange environment, whose very being in these islands left breath that fills us all with the knowing they were here and still are. And I'm just finishing with that quote because I think research, the purpose of research, particularly in the social service field, that we really need to think about what the outcome is that we're after. And it doesn't have to be big. It can be about being part of the resistance and the righting the wrongs of colonization on our people. And decolonizing methodology and research for me is about how we write that in the place that we live here and ensure that women's stories and women's ways of being are truthful to who we are in the 21st century, but also where we've come from. Ngā mihi.
Thank you so much for that input, Kerry. Very much appreciate it. I'm sure it set off all sorts of thoughts, as did Alejandra's presentation. So it's great to have you with us. It's also great to have Nancy, who is next up to speak. So again, just to welcome her, and I'd just like to pass the mic. So away you go, Nancy, whenever you're ready.
Okay, hi everyone. So first of all, thank you so much, Steve, for this invitation to this space. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some understandings. And I'd like to start this presentation by bringing this Mayan principle in Lakek, you are my other self. If I hurt you, I hurt myself. If I love you and respect you, I love and respect myself. So I'd like to bring these words in order for us to start talking or entering the decolonial terrain, because for my understanding, entering this terrain implies reconnecting with the narratives and the ways of being that we have been very commonly unrooted from, right? And then this Mayan principle reminds us precisely that we are interconnected through time and space. And then this is my way of honoring the lands that are embracing us in the UK, that are bringing us here together. It is a way for me to honor also the lands of the Nimipu in the US, in Washington state, where I could develop some of the understandings I'm gonna be sharing this morning. And also the Muiscas community in Colombia, where I am currently residing, and that's my place of origin as well. I would also like to honor our ancestors and the leaders, social leaders in Colombia that have been murdered in 2020, which, well, the numbers are unfortunately increasing. And then for me, this presentation is a way to honor all the paths they have built for us to be here today. This is an image that I like to bring to honor all of our roads, and it's an image that I use in my dissertation in order to represent the different understandings that I was bringing into housing instability in a rural area in the US. This is a way for me to say that we can come from different roads, and that every road into understanding looks different. So that's why there's different puzzles around the different areas in the image, but also that all those different roads that we enter will allow us precisely to connect through discourse and experience. So this is my way of honoring all of you here today and welcome you to this very brief presentation. Okay, so what I'm gonna be sharing is just a little bit of one stage into what it has implied to me and the communities that I have been working with to decolonize. So first of all, I think that it is important to answer one key question for me, and it is how I entered the decolonial terrain, right? So what is it that brings me into the decoloniality and how I enter that space? These ideas are presented or reflected in more depth into my dissertation, so I leave the title there for you to later consult if you're interested. But for me, the process implied like weaving different testimonials of houseless people, and also experiencing my own self-transformation in terms of how I see myself and how I think about myself, and how obviously others also view me in different scenarios, different locations, and at different stages of my own growth. So how do I enter this decolonial terrain? So first of all, I entered the decolonial terrain as a granddaughter of peasants in the Andean region in Colombia. So from that perspective, the connection to land for us is very important, because land is the one who offers, is the one that is the provider, you know, of food that is being placed not only in our table, but the communities that we are part of. And the land also is a way for us to nurture our spirits. So the connection to the land and the act of cultivating the land is also a ritual and a spiritual practice for my family. So I come as a granddaughter of peasants first. I also come as a new mestiza with this new consciousness, and I am drawing from Gloria Anzaldua's work, whose work has inspired me to really understand the complexities of identity construction, to really start exploring different, you know, like lenses that we bring into the different roles that we explore, and moving beyond, you know, the dualities we are usually exposed to, and also the labels that are being imposed upon us, right? So then for me, Gloria Anzaldúa has represented this way of really looking back at my roots, my non-Indigenous and Indigenous roots, and then being able to understand how, or what are the ways that inform the ways, what are the processes that I have experienced and lived experiences as well, that inform the ways I think, the ways I feel, the ways I behave. So Gloria Anzaldúa for me has represented that stage of starting exploring identity, and also I also experienced the anxiety that Anzaldúa experienced in terms of naming without fragmenting, right? So every time we name ourselves or we label ourselves, there's some pieces of our identity that are being left aside. So that's why I identify in general like a human being as under construction, which means that I am in the process of making, and it is a messy process. So we make mistakes and we are learning and unlearning all the time. So I think that that is the term that can really express how I think about myself at this current moment. I see myself as a human being under construction. So that's how I come to you and I present to you. I also come as an EFL pre-service and in-service teacher who's been doing, critical social justice oriented work. And I have been inviting my pre-service and in-service teachers to really engage in these practices that are not very commonly brought into the field of foreign language teaching. So we mostly focus on the linguistic part, but we don't really go beyond analyzing what is it that is our responsibility with social justice issues like racism, amongst others. And I finally come as a non-Indigenous Latin American, human being under construction who's interested in expanding all of these understandings and also interested in taking action in different ways from my role as a researcher and as an administrative now. And then I accept the invitation of our Indigenous scholars who have invited not Indigenous scholars to use critical frameworks that are informed by Indigenous epistemologies, where issues of representation and research benefits are reconciled. So there is an invitation to those of us who may not necessarily be ascribed to an Indigenous community in order to, in a very respectful, of course, manner, enter into the terrain. So that's how I finally entered this terrain, with a profound respect and admiration of all the Indigenous scholars, Chicanx and Latinx feminists in my case, who have resonated with my mind, body, and spirit, and from whom I'm going to be sharing a little bit of understanding this morning. So now, if you don't mind, and for those of you who feel comfortable doing it, I am going to invite you to close your eyes for a brief moment. And so those of you feeling comfortable doing it. Do you know what it means to be in the dark? You're trying to reach outside and you try to walk and it's completely black and you don't know what the ground is like. That's what it is like. It's being in a different place. I've never been before in the dark. There's no flash of light. There's no pitch of light. You don't know if someone's gonna be around the corner. You don't know if there's someone in the bushes. I have a lot of fear. So now I invite you to take a deep breath and to open your eyes and to continue joining me in this journey. So what I have just read is a very short fragment of one of the testimonials of one of the houseless people I worked with in the past. And then I'm bringing this testimonial because for me, it's very interesting to bring Samantha in trying to understand what are the, conscious and subconscious levels that emerge when you are a person who is labeled as homeless, right? And when you are being labeled as homeless, you are ascribing this individual to usually very stigmatizing terms, right? So when you are a homeless, you are being conceived as the drug addict, as the violent person. Historically speaking, women have been considered witches, right? The women that have been labeled as homeless. So for me, Samantha is very special because when I first came across her in the shelter where I conducted this study, she told me a sentence that still resonates with me. So our first encounter was in 2014, and still today it resonates with me. And then she told me back in the day, you know what, like my story is the only thing I own, right? So when Samantha said, my story is the only thing I own, I started, to experience all these ethical dilemmas of, okay, what am I doing here? So what am I be giving back, right? So how am I supporting her throughout her whole, conscious process of experiencing a new identity? And then so all these sort of questions are starting to emerge. And then I was continuously self-questioning and, like thinking about what I should be doing and pushing myself further. So what is coming next? What else am I gonna do for the shelter, for these women, for these men that I've been coming across? So for Samantha, it was very important. So as you can see here in the testimonial, the label homeless comes with a dehumanizing lens, So she was describing a very vivid image by saying in another fragment that she was being considered non-human. So you can see it there. And she says, it's like being a non-human being because I can survive like a rat. I can go and dig on a garbage cans it does not represent safety. It is like you're driving around with this label, you know? So then it comes although that subconscious level. So yeah, as we started to build a relationship with Samantha, so and this is like the first message when we engage into critical decolonial work. As researchers, we might have a lot of expectations. We might have like an initial research question we are very eager, you know, to answer and dig into. But then when it comes to work with different minoritized, stigmatized communities, so we need to pause, right? And we need to let go certain things. In my case, it was important for me to really tell Samantha, like, you don't have to tell me your story if you consider that you're in a very vulnerable stage. So I was letting her go, right? Like, but as time passed by and we started to meet one another, and then there was a point in which she felt comfortable, and she said, oh no, I want to share my story with you. I know you now, right? So then I know what you can do with it and how you can work with it. So then that's the important thing that I've been re-emphasizing and learning from indigenous scholars. They remind us that we are the relationships that we build, right? And that building relationships is, you know, the way in which we can really honor the lives and testimonials that we're collecting, and how we can really trespass this colonizing idea of fragmenting individuals and dissecting their lives for the purposes of research, you know, and dissecting their lives just for adding more categories and labels. And obviously with that practice adding into the dehumanizing idea or stage. So for what the colonial gaze does in research then is, yeah, what I was saying before, like fragmenting, colonizing, labeling, categorizing, without taking into account, you know, the multidimensional or kaleidoscopic ways of being of an individual, right? So we mostly, commonly, or very often forget about the political dimension of a human being we're working with. We forget about the spiritual dimension. We forget about their ontological dimension. So we only see them but the one piece of their identity, in my case, homeless, not having a physical space, you know. So we only consider that label as where you ascribe all their own multidimensional identities. And so here it comes then one of the first questions for us as critical, you know, decolonizing researchers, and is how has qualitative research been experienced and conceptualized by minoritized or stigmatized academic communities and those outside the academy as well, and what has been the road walked and impact achieved by critical ethnographers. So my work was with, or has been with critical ethnography, exploring, you know, and expanding the, and also finding and identifying the tensions that come in the field is still as falling into the trap of colonization and positivism, and how we can move beyond that boundary. In terms of so in previous seminars and today also there has been this mention to these scholars, you know, Linda Tuhiwe Smith, who reminds us that yes, research has been one of the dearest words in the indigenous words vocabulary because of the impact that it has negative impact in the indigenous communities, you know, like misinterpreting their stories, misrepresenting who they are, amongst other issues. Margaret Kovac, which is also a very dear, kind friend of ours through the indigenous circle. So obviously reminds us also that the objective studies of the other are also falling to this colonizing lens. And then Chicana Latinas, Cynthia Saavedra and Nimark, they remind us that when we fall into this type of regurgitating, you know, hierarchical, patriarchal, homophobic, and capitalist relations, so we are falling into the trap of colonization as well. And then critical ethnographers. So when one of the critiques to critical ethnographers is that they are too theory driven, right? And that they lack a little bit of the piece of self-reflexivity that is leading, of course, to these detached research and writing practices. Okay. So then I started exploring a little bit something that I called the building blocks of identity. And then I consider, I say or conceptualize this as this hegemonic, stigmatizing, constraining discriminatory and exclusionary discourses on which societal ideologies and imaginaries of the other are being built. So that's how I conceive these building blocks, in particular in terms of the house list, and then the discourse. What is the issue with discourse as well? As researchers, that's an important point for us to take into account, because we can fall in the trap of portraying the other as the deviant, and rooting them and dehumanizing. So these are some of the labels I was referring to. So homeless equals a pandemic, an epidemic, and mentally ill, lazy people, shadow people, and these are discourses we find in the media, we find in different spaces, in academia as well. So then we start creating this boundary between the us versus them. And very briefly, I will refer to this and I will start closing. In my dissertation, I explore what is going on between the researcher's self, right? I consider that there is this fragmentation, and we have listened to some of our peers talking about research as a nightmare, as a struggle, as a battlefield, something that is not connected to who they are. So, and then Western kinds of ways of knowing promote mostly the cognitive dimension of a researcher, right? So what is it that you can produce, theorize, how many authors can you recite or can you refer to? But then we forget about the bodily and emotional, dimension, and the spiritual dimension as well. In terms of the research itself, so we mostly focus on the body as this element object that we can analyze and dissect, but we also forget about their cognitive dimension and spiritual dimension, amongst other dimensions that I previously mentioned. So then for me, this plus all the debate that we find in critical inquiry, where we find authors speaking about post-critical, conditions. So then I've been questioning, are we there even in the critical condition? Have we really been able to push critical agenda so that we can start talking about post-criticality? So that's a question that we can later debate. So yeah, finally, as a human being under construction, and then we bring our dear friend Sean Wilson, we are the relationships that we hold and are part of. Knowledge is relational. Every human being is a holder of knowledge, and then what I just presented today are just a few decolonial moments. So we don't have to, probably there comes this anxiety with decolonizing theory, decolonizing epistemologies, and how do we decolonize methodologies? I think that within our practices and processes, there are those little decolonial moments that are like the moments of understanding that makes us reassess, from my perspective, the values, that divide. And also are those moments in which we can find our own voice. So for me, the issue of voice is a very important one. So how can we engage in research practices where we can really identify, listen, and amplify our voices, and obviously the voices of those we work with? So as a summary, so I think that starting with the quote of Inla Kek, reminds us of the principle of the interconnectedness. So allow us to acknowledge our existence, the paths we have walked, the responsibility we have with one another, and recognizing, the value that we hold individually and collective. So we are the others, right? So it's not just myself, Nancy, but I am the relationships and the people that I am with. A second, the colonial moment that I consider that I very, very quickly present is what I consider the 21st century neocolonial research condition that has many more components, but that I was presenting about this fragmentation experience by both the researcher and the researched. And third, I think that the testimonials, as learning from our Chicana Latina feminists, are sources of knowledge and theorizing as well. So our lived experiences are also worth of being brought into academia and also as sites of knowledge. And then there is this decolonial moment that for me is an ongoing practice, is continue to explore how to decolonize my own self, as how to continue, exploring different lenses in my own identity and my roles. And also with the communities that I work, and also as a pre-service teacher, how I invite my students to really find their voices throughout this whole process. Decolonizing processes, critical decolonizing agendas allow us to reimagine the world in the midst of chaos and despair, by sharing understandings of the problematic nature of framing others' identities and conducting research that fragment. So finally, these questions for all of us to probably engage in further conversation. So what do our voices or your voices in research or in your philosophies of being sound like and speak to? What are your voices saying? What agendas does our work or is our work ascribed to? What are the values that inform our ways of being, thinking, and doing? And why and how do we engage in research? So some people engage in critical decolonial research. What are the motivations? In other words, what are the motivations that lead us to embark on critical decolonial research journeys? And I want to highlight this because I have been seeing it in my own home country with the field of foreign languages, that the colonial or decolonial has become a trend, but people do not really understand what are the issues with coloniality so that they can engage or embark on decolonial work in a respectful, way, and acknowledging the work that has been already done. So I really appreciate the time for me to present these little understandings, and I'm really looking forward to the dialogue with all of you.
Thank you, Nancy. Speaking of which, I think it's probably about time we started some dialogue. We're running slightly over time, about 12 minutes, so we might think about how we attribute those Zoom sessions. I suppose I passed, with great thanks to Nancy and to Kerry and to Alejandra. Wonderful presentations, all three of you. We're so blessed in the UK to be able to welcome your input. It's fantastic. I think with that, I should probably pass to Angeline, shouldn't I, in terms of the launching the next phase, the breakout rooms, the dialogue aspect?
Yeah, the breakout rooms are all ready to go. How long do you want them to last for?
I think we'd probably need about 20 minutes, and
20 minutes.
And then if we can reconvene for some questions for our guest panel, that would be wonderful.
Okay, so I'm starting them now. If there anyone who very particularly doesn't want to be, doesn't get on with discussion groups or feel comfortable, then please feel free to stay in the main room or just to pop out for a bit and then rejoin us after 20 minutes. And off we go. And if you get bobbed around a bit between rooms in the first couple of minutes, don't worry. That's just me trying to keep the numbers fairly equal, as some people tend to drop out at this point.
Angeline, are we going to have also access to the slides?
So the seminar will be recorded and we have access to that. if the presenters are happy to share the slides in PDF format, then we can also make that available. And I'll provide, I'll give the link now and I'll drop it in again at the end of the session.
Okay. Are we all back?
I think we're still coming back. I'm looking
Okay.
at participant count.
I think we automatically came back, so everyone should be here.
Okay. Well, it looks like a few people have dropped off the tutorial then, because we're down to
Yes.
70 now.
I
So,
have a...
sorry, Adriana.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I just have a list of questions here that we've been gathering in our chat, and I was wondering whether should I go with some of these questions, or could we do a bit of a recap on our breakout groups?
I think we should take questions first. Or yeah, Steve, what do you think?
I just think that sort of we have to keep an eye on time, Shubhanshu. So I think, you know, maybe we should get to the point where people can put their questions to the panel, you know?
Yeah.
So I know that in my, you know, I realise, Adriana, you've been collating questions from the chat, but I know that in my group, Breakout Room 1, the group I was in, there was a question from Trudy for the panel, and I just wonder if she'd care to share that.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm just gonna read it. I posted it in the chat earlier. And it's just generally for the for any of the speakers or organisers. I was wondering if you could say something on the difference, if any, or if you think it's useful to state any, between what it means to decolonize methodology, where methodology is the rationale for choosing a particular method, and method itself as being decolonial. So what a decolonial method in itself is. Thanks.
I think I would say that perhaps there could be a variety of methods that we could use, right, that have a potential for decolonizing or thinking about decolonizing alternatives. However, I guess if we forget that...
From this meeting I've been part of, there is a chance that my research in the future might become something like decolonizing.
Someone else talking? Well, so I was thinking that perhaps the potential of decolonizing method could be lost if we forget sort of the links, to make links or ask questions in relation to where that question comes from and why that research is needed, or the context of that research and where the researcher making the question is embedded in. I guess you could still slip into a relationship of sort of disempowering the researcher, the researched, I guess, or seeing it as a binary between researcher and research instead of a relationship in research. So that would be sort of my view on that. Would anybody?
Yeah, I can add in a little bit. I think I think I absolutely agree with you. But it's also about the starting point. Like if you're trying to decolonize methodology, are you then just trying to make that less Western, or are you starting from the starting point, which is what Adriana said around like the participants and how are you going to go about the research and who needs to be part of that initial part of deciding what that research looks like and posing the questions, and for who are you doing the research for. And then that's the process of decolonizing your methodology, that you start at the starting point and then your methodology is created and developed on the needs of your community, with people at the table who have the voice be part of that decision making is my idea of how you decolonize. And methods themselves, whether or not you choose what methods you choose, there's also a part of decolonizing, and that as well is understanding where those methods, what their whakapapa and genealogy is, and if that then is the right method to use, or is there a way that you can ensure that that method also is decolonized in the process as well. So lots of layers there, but I don't think you can decolonize a methodology because you're starting at the wrong point. I think you start at the start of the process with the purpose of why a community might want you to work with them.
For me personally, this whole decolonizing stage implies different decisions along the way, right? One of the first stages for me that was critical was to really look at myself first. So to decolonize myself in terms of my ways of thinking or exploring my ways of being, acting and being in the world. And so what I invite my colleagues to do is to really, when they want to engage into decolonial work, I ask them about their motivations. So what are your motivations to really engage into decolonial work, right? And once we start and we are, let's say, not fully coherent, but we are, ascribing to some kind of principles that honor and respect the work that has been already done. So then we start like adjusting and answering other kinds of questions and making other kinds of decisions. So one of the messages that we get from the colonial work and indigenous scholars is that there is not a divorce between theory, epistemology, and methodologies, right? So all of them, and as in the wheel that Steve was presenting to us at the beginning, so all of those stages are interconnected, right? The axiological, the ethical part. So in every decision that we make, there's also always like important questions about power relations, so who's in power? What is the relationship that we build with the persons or the participants or the other selves in relation we work with, right? How is the information being presented and how are others represented, right? And how do we share this knowledge with the communities? How we go back to the communities to build knowledge together? So is our work a result of building knowledge from and with and for the communities, right? So there's all these sort of questions that we really need to pay attention to when we engage into critical decolonial work, right? So so that we can avoid, falling once again into the trap of naming the work decolonial while our own practices, discourses, and the theories that we cite and the processes that we conduct are still, marginalizing, are still fragmenting, are still misrepresenting. So I think that the key question would be, how can we, make a holistic process, and what is that? Where am I at in that process, right? So that's a personal, individual question. What stage am I at, even in terms of understanding the colonization first? So what are the issues with colonization? So if I understand what the issues are with colonization and whatever field that I am experiencing, so then I might bring different parts of my identity into the decolonial terrain to continue, you know, developing understandings and also being like coherent or in the lines of decolonial work. And finally, there's something that I listened in previous sessions as well, and it is the part of the praxis, you know, praxis. How is, we don't just rely on the field of theorizing, but praxis comes together. So again, decolonizing, working with communities, building relationships and action. So I think that those are important components. The whole process.
Really interesting point, Nancy. And in relation to that point and the praxis, we got a really interesting question on the chat as well from one of the participants saying, and I think this is a question for Alejandra. The person says, as a trans person, I find I have a real aversion to the implication that behavior is biologically determined. So this person asks, how do researchers in biosciences avoid falling into the trap of biological determinism while still recognizing the biological nature of certain behaviors? If perhaps Alejandra could enlighten us and comment on this question.
Yes, thank you, Adriana. Well, I think that from this biological perspective, the structural determinism, the biological structural determinism, the only limits that have the biology is the loss of the living. So the plasticity that has an organism is until the life ends. So we have a lot of possibilities in this process, in this biological process. So the kind of way of life that the organism wants to live, if the organization of the physiological organization of the living able to, it's fine. So the only limit to the way of life is the death, finally, the disorganization of the living system.
Mm.
Basically, if we adapt to, basically, we could see that not enacting what you want to be as your identity is telling you, and not going in accordance with your biological and mentally and spiritual, perhaps other components of the self are not in accordance, then that could bring an illness or some sort of
I think the problem has been that sort of in the Western social sciences, you know, many people, certainly traditionally in psychology, have subscribed to views of, say, shall we say, genetics as like predestination. I mean, these are arguments which no serious geneticist has made since the 1960s, and yet the social scientists seem to lag about 60 years behind. You know, we can talk about embodiment, we can talk about biological representation, you know, without necessarily subscribing to the almost fatalistic arguments that many psychologists have made. You know, we could look at this, and this is, you know, something which is really interesting, the work that Alejandra presented, you know, whether we talk phenomenologically through experience, through biological representation, or whether we talk about the stories, the narrative about ourselves and land and our relationships to the natural world and our own histories and all the rest of it, you know, they're all part of that storytelling, you know, without getting into these rather dodgy and I might say politically right-wing sort of arguments that social scientists do tend to fall into from time to time. Do we have anything else from the chat, Adriana?
I think we've covered quite a lot of the questions, at least in like the smaller groups as well. So I guess we could leave it to our presenters to say some final words and thank you for coming today from different time zones and joining us. And if you would like to say a few words to say goodbye, basically, but thank you very much for participating.
I want to add a point to what Nancy said before about the decolonize ourselves. That it's as we are social beings, it's not only a thing of decolonize ourselves alone, because in this sense we are going to get out of the system. So it's necessary to create a community that deepen in this feeling of the need of decolonize. So I think that is very important, this space to share our views and have this basis of the decolonization.
Yeah, I'd like to end, by thanking every one of you for bringing, your whole presence and stories and histories with you into this space. I know that there are many challenges that we experience from our roles as administrators and as teachers and in real life with our families. Not everything is perfect in what we do, and it shouldn't be like that way. But I want to honor all the work that you've been doing, and despite all the struggles that we may encounter, I hope that we find the force, that inner force, we keep on working and doing the work that needs to be done. So we need to raise our voices. We need to be highlighting, any kinds of discriminatory practices that we encounter, in our context. So for other generations, to see that we are being responsible with our own processes in here. And finally, I'd like to leave you with some words of Gloria Anzaldúa, who says, it's a short poem, who says, "May the roaring force of our collective creativity heal the wounds of hate, ignorance, indifference, dissolve the divisions, creating chasms between us, open our throats so we who fear speaking out raise our voices. By our witnessing, find connections through our passions, pay homage to those whose backs served as bridges. We remember our death, and in my case, it is Gloria Anzaldúa, Elisa Facio, Maria Lugones, y tantas otras, amongst others. It is my personal prayer that our bodies become our homes, and that our decolonial journeys bring us together for peace to become the utopia that we can fulfill." So thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Nancy. Kerry, would you like to add a few words to that?
Yeah, I don't know how I follow Nancy with that, but thank you for allowing me to participate and share in this process. I think that decolonizing research is a process, and everyone is at different points, and we can come together and we can talk about that, and we won't always agree, and that's part of the beauty of the different places that we live and our experiences and histories that we bring with us. I think that for me, one of the really essential parts of doing research that is decolonizing is that we take with us kindness and heart into that. And yeah, I just say go forth with your kindness and your heart for the communities that you live in and research with. And that will be the beautiful starting point of ensuring that you are researching with your community and centering their voices. Mahi.
Thank you, Kerry. I know I'm very grateful to all participants and particularly to our guest speakers, but maybe in terms of the formal thanks, perhaps I could pass that to Angeline, that job.
Certainly. Huge thanks, Alejandra, Kerry, Nancy, for your presentations, for the thought that you've put into them, for sharing with us your research and the way that you've gone about designing it and the way you've gone about conducting it. And this is organised by a doctoral training program. I'm sure this will all enrich the ideas that people here are able to put into planning and designing their own research. Thank you very much. Steve, Adriana, Shubhranshu, thank you for the thoughtfulness and care that's gone into putting together this whole seminar. And it's been a very stimulating seminar and very much in tune with the series as a whole. And so thank you for your involvement actually from the very beginning when this was still just an idea on a piece of paper. So a huge amount of thanks. Next week is the 5th and final seminar in the series. It's being convened by Ziba, Deborah and Suzanne. I think Ziba and Suzanne may still be with us. Do either of you want to kind of give a little brief kind of, say a couple of things about it? I've put the link, which is both a link through which you can register for the next seminar, and it's the link where you can find resources that have been generated from previous seminars and where we will post the recording of this one. So it's one link where you'll find everything related to the seminar series. I've put that in the chat a couple of times. I'll just add it one more time. Ziba, are you still with us? Do you want to say anything about next week?
Suzanne, did you want to say something or shall I? Right, okay. Well, next week's we've got the final and the best, if I may say so myself. We're planning to go out on a bang, or with a bang. So yes, we have the Decolonizing Writing and Representation one. We will have 4 speakers, one of them recorded. We already have the recording and it's fantastic. And they are going to be talking about different aspects of writing and representing your research in ways that are not the norm, if you like. So yes, we look forward to it. And Angeline has just put the link again in the chat. So please do sign up and we'll see you next week.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now. I usually then just hold the Zoom meeting open for a few minutes because it seems a bit abrupt to